It's been nearly a year since I reached my breaking point, though I wish I could say that everything had been fine before that. The truth is, our relationship had always been a roller coaster. The first few months were full of excitement, passion, and sweetness, but slowly, things started to shift. It wasn't like one day everything changed. It was a slow burn, little shifts that over time became glaringly obvious. At the start, he was everything I thought I wanted: charming, funny, loving. We clicked in a way that felt undeniable. He made me feel special, like I mattered, and I fell for him deeply. But soon, I started to notice the cracks. They were small at first, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but they grew harder to ignore. He could be sweet and affectionate one moment, and the next, he'd snap for no reason, like a switch had been flipped. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just stress, or maybe a bad day. But the bad days turned into bad weeks, and the kindness that once felt so familiar started to feel like a memory. There were times when I couldn't even recognize him. He'd lash out over trivial things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of our lives, like me leaving a dish out or not texting back immediately. And it wasn't just the yelling, although that was bad enough. It was the way he made me feel so small, so worthless. He'd call me names, degrading things that no one should ever say to someone they supposedly love. He'd make cruel jokes at my expense, twisting words until they felt like a punch in the gut. I started to feel like I was walking on eggshells, constantly bracing for the next outburst. And yet, there would be moments, often in the aftermath of these explosions, where he'd apologize. He'd cry, beg for my forgiveness, promise he would change. I wanted to believe him, I really did. Because when things were good, they were so good. We'd laugh together, talk for hours, share secrets. He made me feel loved again, like maybe this was just a rough patch, something we could work through. But those moments of peace were always temporary, and eventually, the cycle would start all over again. By the time I reached the point of deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I had already been through so much. He'd threatened to leave me countless times, said things that cut to the core, things that no one should ever say in a relationship. One night, he even woke me up in the middle of the night to scream at me about something so trivial I can barely even remember it. That night, I stayed up with tears in my eyes, waiting for the storm to pass. But it didn't pass. It dragged on, hour after hour, until the early morning hours, leaving me emotionally and physically drained. I can't remember how many times he told me he was done, or how many times he used the silent treatment to punish me. One minute, he'd be threatening to break up, and the next, he'd be begging for me to stay. And it always happened over the smallest things, like me being a few minutes late, or not having the energy to constantly reassure him when I was busy with work. It all came to a head one night when, after one of these emotional explosions, I just couldn't take it anymore. He'd gone into a fit of rage over something so small, and when I tried to stand my ground and say I needed space, he hit me with the words I feared the most. It's over. I was utterly spent, emotionally bankrupt. I felt numb and so tired. I knew I couldn't stay, not like this. So, I decided to check into a motel, just to get some distance and clear my head. But as I was packing my things, he changed his mind. He suddenly flipped again, and in a panic, he grabbed a knife. He held it to his throat and told me he'd end his life if I left. The words, the sheer madness of it all, left me frozen. I don't think I even fully registered what was happening. I was so scared, and my mind went into survival mode. I told him that if he didn't drop the knife, I'd call the cops. And for what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence, broken only by his shaky breath. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he dropped it. I felt like I could finally breathe again, but the relief was short-lived. All I could think was how I needed to get away, to heal. I spent the next few hours just trying to keep him calm, trying to convince him that I wasn't leaving him forever, just needed a break to think things through. He didn't understand, of course. But I didn't know what else to do. He agreed to let me go to the motel, and I left with my head spinning. I needed space to think, to make sense of everything that had just happened. At the motel, I was a wreck. My mind kept replaying the events over and over, and my hands shook as I dialed the number for a domestic violence hotline. I didn't know what else to do, and honestly, I was terrified of what would happen if I stayed in that relationship. When the woman on the other end of the line told me that I was being abused, it felt like someone had slapped me across the face. I had never thought of it that way before. I always justified it as just bad moments, rough times. But hearing it out loud made me realize how dangerous things had gotten. I didn't know who else to turn to, so I called a friend, a man I'd been talking to casually for a few weeks. He knew about the abuse, but until that point, we'd only shared friendly conversations. I never thought he'd make it about anything else. But that night, things changed. As I told him everything, all the chaos and the fear I was feeling, his response was calm, kind, and understanding. For the first time in ages, I felt heard. And then, he told me he had feelings for me. I didn't know how to respond. I was in shock, and to be honest, I didn't even really feel present in the moment. I think I was so starved for kindness and attention that I found myself flirting back. It felt like a lifeline. Someone was showing me that I was worth something again. But that relief quickly turned into something I didn't recognize. Our conversation took a turn, and before I knew it, I was in a situation that felt wrong. I pulled back, suddenly realizing what was happening. I was vulnerable, emotionally shattered, and this friend took advantage of that. His true colors showed through in an instant. I saw his social media, the endless parade of scantily clad women he followed, and it made me sick to my stomach. I cut him off right then and there. I deleted the conversation, blocked him on everything, and vowed never to let him back into my life. But that wasn't the end of it. The guilt started to sink in. I hated myself for what had happened. I felt like I'd betrayed my boyfriend, and I hated that I'd even allowed myself to flirt with someone else, even if it was out of desperation. I felt like a liar, a cheater. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. Then came the overwhelming regret. I missed my boyfriend. I hated myself, but in that moment of weakness, I let him come to the motel. We had a conversation, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth about what happened. I couldn't tell him about the friend, the flirting, the betrayal. Instead, he convinced me to come back with him. He promised everything would change. He said he'd never treat me that way again. And for a brief moment, I believed him. We went back together, and everything felt like it had before, like a dream, but a dream I couldn't wake up from. He apologized, and we moved on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't let go of that night. I couldn't let go of what I'd done. It haunted me. Every night, I'd lay awake, replaying the events in my mind, wishing I could erase it all. As the years passed, things didn't get better. The emotional and verbal abuse continued, and I kept it all hidden. I never told him about that night. I couldn't. I was terrified that if he knew, he'd leave me for good. But it weighs on me every single day. The guilt, the shame, the fear of him finding out, it's always there, lurking in the background. I dream about it sometimes, and when I wake up, I feel like I can't breathe. The fear of being caught, of being seen as a liar, a cheater, has never left me. And here I am, trapped in this cycle of abuse, unable to break free. He thinks I'm always cheating, and I don't know what would happen if he ever knew the truth about that night. I'm terrified of what would happen to me. I don't know how to live with this guilt anymore. I feel like a terrible person, and it's eating me alive. But I needed to get this off my chest. I need someone to understand. I need to know I'm not as bad as I feel. I don't know what the future holds, but I can't keep carrying this weight alone.